Hello everyone, thank you for joining us today. I hope all of you are doing well and keeping safe during these trying times. Speaking of these unprecedented times, I know that most of us have a newfound appreciation for our public spaces. Am I not right? So I thought I would take this opportunity to emphasize the importance of well-designed public spaces for building community, especially in settings where high cultural diversity is present, and also to go over some of the aspects that has to be considered when to maximize their potential, which was the main focus area of my master's research. I will start off by giving a brief introduction to the concept of intercultural communities. Then I will move on to talk about public space, what it is, why is it so important, and finally, I will talk about the aspects that has to be considered when designing these public spaces. The intercultural community is a concept that has come up in the recent years as a result of many cities increasingly becoming culturally diverse. And the goal of this concept is to basically manage cultural diversity as an asset and a resource for those cities. So let's quickly look at what do I mean by cultural differences. When we talk about cultural differences, it doesn't necessarily mean the differences due to ethnic backgrounds, but rather the different ways of life that has developed due to pre-existing shared meanings and derivatives, which individuals are nurtured and groomed to follow, and new meanings and observations which are discovered by these members through testing those pre-existing meanings and purposes. So it's important to note that cultural boundaries are not fixed and are always changing and remaking. With this in mind, the basic idea of intercultural community is to facilitate mixing between diverse populations so that a mutual ground between people of different cultures can be developed and social cohesion among them can be enhanced. So to support an intercultural community, there need to be favorable conditions enabling interactions and reciprocities. There are many ways through which we can enable interactions, but public spaces have been identified to be one of the key areas affecting the creation of intercultural communities. So, what are public spaces? Well, public space is a widely contested term. It has been interpreted in various ways by different people. But for me, what best describes public space is Lowe and Smith's notion of public space as a social space, which can either be physical, electronic, and even be an institutional space, owned and managed by either public or private organization. I like this concept because it acknowledges that public spaces include not only the formal areas of gathering like the squares, parks, the green spaces, but also other spaces like the streets, markets, playgrounds, malls, even social media platforms that are accessible by the public. And that in these public spaces that individuals and groups encounter one another and sort of negotiate each other's presence. So why are public spaces important? Other than the obvious benefits for play, recreation, health, wellness, which are of course essential for improving and maintaining the quality of life of the citizens, public spaces also act as the hubs that connect people to one another. So public spaces also play a really big role in building community. Now, one could ask, how can spontaneous encounters that take place in public spaces create so deep social bonds? Well, maybe not at the outset, but they're really great in providing opportunity for developing those strong connections because these spaces allow for interactions at various levels, right? From just mere sightings to greetings to more meaningful interactions. So the continuation of these encounters ultimately lead for developing connections. And also, these spaces help to maintain already established contacts, inform one about the social world outside them, and inspire and offer stimulating experiences. So public spaces play a really big role in strengthening community and people in them. But public space can only fulfill this role if they manage to meaningfully engage diverse audiences. Those spaces that don't often tend to underperform. So, how do we get people to engage in these public spaces? Well, a person's engagement in a space really depends on that person's perception of the space. And that person's perception of the space is influenced by that person's background, age, gender, culture, education, etc. So based on this, literature has highlighted few aspects that has to be considered when planning and designing these spaces to encourage its use and to ultimately support building community. I found all of them sort of fall under three main categories. First, removing barriers that would prevent or discourage one's entry to the public space, improving the multiplicity of the space, and third, improving the patterns of movement. For any public space to support social interaction among diverse individuals, first and foremost, those spaces should be designed and developed to remove any barriers, be it physical, financial, legal, psychological, or cultural, which would prevent or discourage one from entering that space. Essentially, it has to be an inclusive space, which is equally accessible by all, irrespective of their culture or any other difference. There are few factors which may promote or prevent a person or group from entering or remaining in public spaces, and these include sense of safety, security and comfort, restrictive controls and regulations, and competing or conflicting uses. Sense of safety, security and comfort is an important criteria that determines the likelihood of a person entering or using a space. So to encourage people to congregate in public spaces, those spaces have to be planned and designed to be sensitive to this need. Now, sense of safety, security and comfort definitely vary from person to person, and it's attributed to a number of reasons. But there are few factors that are common for most individuals, irrespective of their background. And those are security from crime, safety from vehicles, and comfort from outdoor elements. The feeling of insecurity from crime in a given space has a big impact on the use of that particular space. Having recognized this, many theorists and researchers have introduced various strategies to overcome these effects. For example, Jane Jacobs has suggested planning and designing neighborhoods to have eyes on the street. Now, if you look at safety from vehicles, this is a really important aspect that has proven to inhibit the use of public space. The strategies for overcoming these can be as simple as introducing speed bumps on the road to control the traffic or demarcating set pedestrian pathways. Comfortable outdoor weather is another significant factor influencing people's movements and pauses in public spaces. For a person to be inspired to spend their time in a public space, the microclimate within that space has to be optimal. So the annual and the diurnal microclimate conditions should be taken into careful consideration when planning and designing public spaces. Moving on to restrictive controls and regulations. Increasingly, many elements of the public spaces are becoming controlled and regulated, aiming to increase safety and security within the public realm. These measures, taken without careful consideration of their impacts, have the potential of denying certain social groups from congregating in public sphere. So, measures that are taken to control and regulate the public spaces have to be chosen very carefully. The third aspect, which prevents or discourages one's entry to the public space, is the competing or conflicting uses. Contradictory lifestyles of individuals and groups belonging to different cultures are particularly evident in their use of public spaces. And for this reason, public spaces are getting are subjected to competing or possibly conflicting uses, where these conflicting behaviors could even lead to exclusion of certain people from those public spaces. In most cases, it is those who are perceived as breaking established conventions of behavior and norms that are excluded. But as we identified earlier, it is these encounters in public spaces that mainly provide the opportunity for different individuals and groups to experience each other. So, when we're designing public spaces, it has to be really taken into consideration. So now let's move on to our second theme, which is improving multiplicity of uses. The variety of facilities and services offered in a public space is another criteria that determines the likelihood of a person entering or using that space. As I mentioned earlier, culturally diverse individuals and groups have diverse sets of needs, preferences, and constraints. So in order to support building community among culturally diverse individuals through public spaces, it's really important to improve the variety of uses it offers, and in order to bring as many individuals to the public space as possible. Our third and final aspect was improving pattern of movement. For the final time, I'm going to say the most fundamental precondition for promoting intercultural integration between culturally diverse individuals is drawing those individuals and groups to public spaces where they can encounter one another. So, while the two aspects we talked about earlier, removing barriers and improving multiplicity of uses, are crucial for improving the use of public spaces, it's developing the patterns of movement through planning and designing to draw people to use these public spaces is an important aspect that increases encounter. So in order to do so, these movement patterns have to be considered in line with other elements in the context. For example, public transport regimes or opening times of the surrounding facilities, distribution of amenities, distribution of vegetation and street furniture, and design of street frontages, and so on. So there you have it, the three main aspects that has to be considered when designing public spaces to support community building. I have to note that this might not be an exhaustive list of things that has to be considered, but rather the key aspects that has to be considered when designing public spaces, be it physical, virtual, publicly owned, or even privately owned.